Jumbo Espresso Talk Today community. It's Robin here. Thank you so much for joining us today for this uncommon conversation. Today, the Espresso Talk Today team is meeting with Professor William A. Smith from the University of Utah. Now, this is not our first meeting with Professor Smith, but the Espresso Talk Today team had more questions, and Professor Smith was gracious enough to return to answer our questions. Professor Smith brings a wide range of knowledge and experience to the conversation, and we're going to tap into as much of that knowledge and experience as time permits. So Ben and Diane will arrive in just a minute, and we'll get started then. While we wait, let me tell you a little bit about Professor Smith. William A. Smith is a full professor and department chair in the Department of Education, Culture, and Society at the University of Utah. He also holds a joint appointment in the Ethnic Studies Program, African American Studies Division, as a full professor. He served as the Associate Dean for Diversity, Access, and Equity in the College of Education, as well as a special assistant to the president of the University of Utah and is NCAA faculty athletics representative. He's a co-editor of the book, The Racial Crisis in American Higher Education. His research primarily focuses on racial battle fatigue, which is the cumulative emotional, psychological, physiological, and behavioral effects that racial microaggressions and macroaggressions have on Black people. And we're going to talk about that a lot today. Dr. Smith's work has appeared in many prestigious journals, too many to name right now. As you can see, we have a real powerhouse in the house today. And we're grateful that Dr. Smith is willing to join our humble but uncommon show. What are we going to talk about? Well, as I said, Professor Smith is going to introduce us to the concept of racial battle fatigue. He will explain what racial battle fatigue is, but we'll go beyond that. We'll discuss the roots of racial battle fatigue. We'll discuss white fear. We'll discuss microaggressions and macroaggressions and how they impact Black mental health. And we'll even discuss something called offensive racist mechanisms. Well, I'm not going to spoil the show, so I'll stop there, although we might even touch upon critical race theory. Okay, I'm definitely stopping here. You can hear it all for yourself. You know, if you're part of the global Black community, I know that you're going to recognize some of the experiences and the stress that Professor Smith will discuss, but you might be surprised about some of the roots of anti-Blackness. People of other races will also learn a lot about the Black experience living in an anti-Black environment, and perhaps even learn ways that they can be allies to their Black friends and family members. We have a great show for you today. Spoiler alert, this is the first part of a longer conversation. We're going to continue this conversation next week, and you definitely don't want to miss that. Well, it seems as though Ben and Diane have just arrived. So sit back, relax, grab an espresso, and let's get started. Habari, Ben. Habari, Diane.
Injama.
How's it going? Yeah, I can reply in Swahili.
Going well, thanks. So great to see both of you again. And as you can see, I'm having an espresso. You saw my espresso drink a minute ago, with a very special guest, Professor William Smith. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for an espresso. Professor Smith is here to discuss a topic that's really, really important. It's really interesting, somewhat distressing, but a little bit empowering too. We'll see why I think towards the end, called racial battle fatigue. But first, let me introduce Diane Bradley, who's a lawyer based in DC, specializing in employment discrimination and civil rights law, and some other areas too. And Ben Koponen, a political science student at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Sorry, Maastricht was my alma mater. And he's also doing a philosophy minor as well. So
Yes.
welcome to both of you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
the introduction.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So Professor Smith, professor of psychology at the University of Utah, has done extensive research on racial battle fatigue, actually coined the term. And he met with me and Marlene, my cousin Marlene, about a year ago to discuss this topic. That discussion triggered really in me a quest for learning more about the effect of racism on Black health, mental health, physical health, and well being in general. Now, Diane and Ben have been in on many of these discussions since then with public health experts like Dr. Georges Benjamin, epidemiologist Professor Sermon James, who discussed John Henryism with us, an expert in Black psychology, Dr. Theopia Jackson, medical racism historian, Professor Deidre Cooper Owens, and then just ordinary Black folks and elders who discuss their experiences. So the ETT team is really working at trying to pull all of this together. And I think that's how it all's linking back to you, Professor Smith. So let's get started with our uncommon conversation about racial battle fatigue, recognizing it, coping with it, and basically trying not to get sick, depressed, or die from it. So let me begin with a basic question, Professor Smith. What is racial battle fatigue?
Well, racial battle fatigue, in a technical sense, is a systemic, race related, repetitive stress injury. So when you break that up and talk about it in layperson's terms, these are the things at the micro level, macro level of our society that continuously perpetuates harm against a group of racialized, minoritized people. So if we're speaking about Black people, it's all of those micro level aggressions, macro level aggressions within the schools, the workplace, the neighborhoods, driving while Black, um, the abundance of liquor stores, and violence that's allowed to happen in those communities that causes stress at both the psychological level, which then impacts at the biological level and vice versa. So if a threat of racism should be coded as a violent act, and a violent act then has a detrimental effect on the body and the mind.
So, I mean, you're talking about racism as being a violent act, even if there's no particular, physical attack to it, or
Yeah,
how does.
yeah. Well, I mean, what we can really look at is that you do not have to have the perpetrator or the aggressor in your face. It's like what psychologist Claude Steele says, a threat in the air. So these are things that can happen, and you can walk into a situation where the climate or the environment is already an anti-Black environment, and therefore you can suffer from racial battle fatigue contagion, which is someone else might be dealing with racial battle fatigue, and you might not have even experienced that situation, but they are a group member, and that can be transferred onto you. Let's look at it much like Omicron or this COVID
Okay.
19 virus. You could do everything possible to protect yourself from white supremacy, anti-Blackness, but try to walk into an environment that is anti-Black and don't have those measures in place to protect yourself. You are at risk of being contaminated,
Yeah.
sick.
I think that's a very interesting point, but you also mentioned anti-Black environment.
Yes.
How would you, I mean, the answer may seem obvious, but how would you define an anti-Black environment? Like, what does that look like to you
Well,
or in general?
I know your listeners are worldwide, so forgive me for using examples in the United States. But those examples in the United States can apply to anywhere on the globe.
Mhm.
First, we have to recognize that anti Blackness is global. Anti Blackness is a pandemic, right?
Yeah.
a pandemic of racism. There's no corner of the earth that you can go that does not have an anti-black script, does not have anti-black laws or a history of anti-black laws. If you look at who's at the bottom of every society, you can quite often find black people. If we go to Mexico, you see that the Afro Mexicanos were at the bottom. They just got citizenship just a few years ago. If we go to India, you see the untouchables,
Hmm.
right? Who are the untouchables? They're us, they're African people. And if you go to anywhere in Europe, you see the problems that we have. So I know I said I was going to use a U.S. example. So let me kind of segue to that. This country was founded on anti-black laws. It was founded on enslavement of African people who are brilliant scholars and pharmacists and agriculturalists and you name it. Stupid people did not develop this country, all right? So when you look at it, there were laws put in place that some people erroneously today call it a white-black binary. That's very disingenuous. It's not a white-black binary. And what they tend to be talking about is, well, the discussions tend to focus just on white and black people. Okay, so let's be quite fair. We know that whiteness goes from pro-white to anti-black, from human to non-human,
Hmm.
to perfection to imperfection. And everything in between that is where all other groups fall. And as they were becoming a part of the U.S. fabric, they fought for laws to distance themselves from African people. All right, there's a great book called the Mississippi Chinese, and
Hmm.
in that book, written by James Lowen, who died just recently, James Lowen lays out this argument where Chinese in the South were considered human by whites, but they didn't have the full privilege of whiteness, right? And they didn't want their children to go to school with blacks or Negroes at that time. And when you saw that they took, they made a suit that went all the way up to the Supreme Court that said we are human just like you, and we want our children to go to schools just like you. The problem with that is that the Supreme Court recognized that they weren't Negroes, that they weren't um, non-humans.
Hmm.
But at that time, many of those Chinese businessmen had married black women and had children with them. So what happens? They come back to Mississippi, and what the whites in Mississippi and what the arguments from the Supreme Court says essentially imply you have to disown your black wife. You have to disown your black children, right? And many, not all, but many did such a fact. So they got rid of their wives, disowned their children, and they benefited from whiteness. They weren't totally white.
Yeah.
And some don't look at this definition of honorary whites from a historical position. So now you see that there are groups that lay between white and black, pro-white, anti-black, human, non-human, um, something to desire, something that's uh, not desirable.
Yeah.
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 And that's the way that an anti-blackness continues and gets perpetuated. So the in or non-human factor of anti-blackness still exists today.
Hmm.
So that's how we understand um, why it was so easy to take pictures with the corpse of a lynched black man or a lynched black woman or black children.
Yeah.
And you would
Yeah.
see children taking pictures around the corpse,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
when have we heard in the history of the United States, at least, white people going to therapy to deal with that anti-blackness?
And I have a question, Professor Smith, just around that same issue right there that you've raised. What do you think is the underlying cause for whites to engage, or for that matter, to maintain a system of anti-Blackness?
Well, complex question. I expect that from a lawyer. But
I'm curious.
well, part of it is fear, and part of it is the lack of understanding the deep cultural assets of black people. So what I mean by that is, if I did to you or you did to me as a white person what we did to you, I would kill you. I would kill you in your sleep,
Mhm.
right? And that's the history that we see even on white violence in Europe um, and all through the world, conquering different places, even among white nations, right? So I will kill you, I will torture you. And we have not seen that from black people, despite 400 years and more, right? And,
Right.
and that's just unfathomable that you could have a group of people who still um, have not shown anti-whiteness in major ways. And some still worship a white Jesus,
Mhm.
right? And that's a different story for a different day.
Yeah.
Right.
I think part of it is fear. Part of it is, what some argue as mental enslavement, and false education, or as Dr. Carter G. Woodson would say, the miseducation of the Negro.
Mm-hmm.
So schooling is a way to pacify black people and to indoctrinate them into a way of not really looking for answers to develop their community, but not to attack whiteness and to perpetuate it. So I think those are some of the ways in which we see this maintaining itself.
And I'm very curious. You mentioned also about living against anti-whiteness, and this dichotomy that you really unpacked. Uh, I think one way of looking at it is in terms of black and white, not necessarily representing races, but different ideological positions that people can associate with. So when you were saying anti-whiteness, does that represent an ideological rejection uh, of that system in general, or of a particular, or of something else?
Now you said anti-whiteness, right?
Oh, yes, yeah, yeah.
So
Because you were just saying, why don't we
yeah.
commit to that?
So black people really don't have a history so far in that, and even in the organizations that they say are anti-white, they can't even prove that there's been any damage to white. So if I
Mhm.
were to take this case to court um, with Attorney Bradley, we would win. Show me the proof, show me the evidence, show me a system that is supported by a pro-black ideology that has caused damage, psychological or bodily damage to whites. Now we have to remember that the UN has a definition of genocide, and it is clear in that agreement that genocide is an attack in whole or in part at the bodily or mental level. Can we as black people make an argument for genocide against black people, even to this day? I would argue yes. Last year, it was 2021, and I think I spoke to you about this when we spoke before. But the book, We Charge Genocide,
Oh.
the Crime of Government Against the Negro People, which was authored by, this was a report to the UN by William Patterson, and it had many co-petitioners like W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and others. And when in 1951, when they took that petition, were taking that petition to the UN in Paris, Du Bois' passport was seized. He was not allowed to travel, and he was considered a foreign agent of the state. Paul Robeson was able to turn over the papers in, I think, New York or D.C. there at the consulate, but Patterson sent the report ahead of him and went to Paris, and in that report laid out all of the crimes in the last like 40 years that was happening to black people. We could still make that argument today. If you can catch that white cop putting his knee on George Floyd's neck in the broad daylight, and all of these other things that the ACLU records, anti-blackness, anti-black hate crimes are always the highest across the country and on college campuses. In fact, here at the University of Utah, just the other day, we had a bomb threat on our Black Cultural Center. And there were also bomb threats at 8 HBCU campuses.
Heard of that.
Now, you ask yourself this question. Utah has a black population of around 1.5% and 2.6% black population within the Salt Lake City area. So black people make up the minority of people, of a group in this state. But yet they're the ones that attacked. There's a much bigger Mexican population here. There's an equal proportion of Native Americans here. There's a larger portion of Asian Pacific Islander groups collectively here. But they attacked black. In a couple years, go ahead, attorney.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, finish your thought, and I have a question.
A few years before that, it was anti-black misandric attacks, where they had a black man looking like a beast, accosting a white woman, and then they had all these erroneous statistics about how many blacks commit crimes, how many white women get raped, and all this other stuff. And we know if a band of black men were raping all these white women, they would be lynched.
Yeah.
That's one murder or attack that never goes unsolved. Matter of fact, they'll pin it on somebody.
Yeah. That's
No,
they will.
That's to make sure there's peace.
Right.
Sorry. You were going to ask a question.
Yeah, and I was just going to follow up with regards to the assault, as you described, on blacks, and particularly even when they're in the minority, such as in Utah. You know, and you had mentioned earlier that fear may be one of the factors of the anti-Blackness issue. Can you talk more about that element around fear in blacks in terms of how their position in the U.S. as well as around the world that you believe may be an influence on why there's such an anti-Blackness?
Well, globally, we outnumber almost everybody, right? And we're everywhere. And I actually, I'm wearing this warrior shirt of black women, African women warriors from the movie Black Panther on. Remember in the Black Panther, they were talking about being in different locations and supporting black people from all over the world, right?
Yeah.
What if we unified in all of these locations? What might happen to disrupt whiteness and white supremacy, right? We don't, have you ever been in a space where you get a lot of questions from white people? They just want to know what you're thinking.
Yeah.
How you feeling? Are you okay? Right?
Yeah.
And I'm like, man, do I look like I'm stressed? There's no problem asking me all these questions.
Oh my God, yeah.
Because they gotta know. They're scared. So they only want certain kind of black people in certain kinds of position. Because what happens when a conscious black person enters a room, the dynamics change. Now, if you had that red, black, and green flag in your office at work, people be like asking a lot of questions because I don't know
Well,
if we could trust you.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. Almost every person I come over asks a bunch of questions about it. Like I think they just haven't seen it before, but it's always fun to.
Right.
I see your point, is what I'm saying. I see your point.
Yeah. Yeah. So the thing is, in many positions, what they'll do is they'll put a black person in that position that we feel comfortable with, because
Mhm.
white people feel stressed too. They feel stress, and then I'm not painting with a broad stroke. I'm painting on specific kinds of people. All right.
Mhm.
So I don't want anybody to say, "Well, oh, you said all this and that," and go viral. But
Mhm.
what I'm talking about is an environment, and in that environment, there's an ecology, and there's an ecological fit to that environment. And the people in that environment must think alike. We have to agree to similar principles. And what is the mission? And if I bring in a black person who might be conscious, you could upset that ecology. You're an ecological misfit, right? And so we can't say the things that we want to say out in the open when we can't trust you,
Mhm.
right? There's a old movie, Attorney Bradley, called The Firm.
Oh, yeah.
You
Remember that
remember that?
movie? I remember that movie. Yes.
Well, go look at it. Once you in, you can't get out. You
Yeah.
got to do something real. You got to outsmart the firm
That's
in
right.
order to get out. And that's where black people lay. Once they get the accoutrements of success, they give them all these awards. You get the money. You're not supposed to talk. You're not
Mhm.
supposed to threaten the order. And if you start to threaten it in the least bit, they try to force you out. But once we get you in, they try to make sure that you don't act um, opposite to the ecology of whiteness.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. Ben, I
Yeah.
think you had a question that you wanted to pose to.
Yeah, it did. So all those events you're describing, they sound, and I think all of us can relate to them to some degree. They sound very stressful. But so would you relate all of these different things to racial battle fatigue and henceforth define racial battle fatigue as a type of stress in itself?
Yeah, it's the effects of it. So
Okay.
all of those things are the accumulation of those things turned into racial battle fatigue. So
Hmm.
racial battle fatigue is the psychological race-related stress, the biological race-related stress, the emotional, behavioral, race-related stress, and the stress within the society. So all that collectively adds up to racial battle fatigue.
Yeah.
And you've heard the term black rage and all this other
Yeah.
stuff before,
Yeah.
right? Do you know who David Allen Greer is?
Well, this is where we're going to stop for today. But this uncommon conversation is definitely far from over. Do you know who David Allen Greer is? Well, Diane, Ben, and I didn't. If you don't, you'll find out next week. Promise. That really was a great conversation. And we're just getting started, but there is a lot to unpack here already. Many thanks, Asante Sana, to Professor William Smith for discussing the problem of racial battle fatigue. I totally appreciated and sadly recognized his opening thoughts about living in an anti Black environment and that it is a global problem. Personally, I've lived in the United States and in several European countries, and I can definitely attest to the fact of global anti Blackness. I'm not looking for anti Blackness, but I definitely find it again and again. Many countries proudly state their color blindness, and it's just not true. I hear companies and corporations and schools and even people announcing their colorblindness. Yet, their anti-Blackness just rings through, certainly louder than their weak words of colorblindness. Thinking about it, actually, I don't think that colorblindness should be a goal in every situation, maybe not in most. That just strips people of their culture and their lived experiences, particularly in a racist system. I think the goal should be anti-racism or anti-white supremacy. But you tell me what you think about that. I really want to know. Well, as we learned, racial battle fatigue is a real thing, and it's affecting Black mental health and well-being, increasing morbidity or increasing chronic illness, and decreasing longevity in the Black community. I think it's like post-traumatic stress syndrome, except that it's not post, it's not in the past, it's not an experience of the past that's having symptoms in the present. And please, don't think that I'm diminishing PTSD in any way. It is real and it's devastating. But racial battle fatigue, even the name, suggests that the battle is still continuing, that we're still living in the battle, not knowing when or where the combatant will appear, or when or where we'll be thrown into combat. And it really is exhausting. I remember civil rights heroine Fannie Lou Hamer saying, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." I am too. But having a name for it is empowering and lets you know that what you're feeling is real and that you are not alone. As Professor Smith said, racial battle fatigue is a repetitive stress injury. It is a stress response to living in a racist environment. It can lead to illness and premature death. Microaggressions are real, and your feelings about them matter. Macroaggressions are real, and your feelings are real, and they matter too. Professor Smith said in a previous show about microaggressions, and this is a quote, "They are a way to keep people in their place." That's what racial microaggressions do. They keep people in their place and keep them out of other places where they are not welcome. Yes, all of it is real. Professor Smith also noted, and this is one of my favorite quotes from him, "Your body is a human lie detector. You can't deny what's going on within your body. You can play mind games with yourself, but physiologically, your body seeks balance, and any threat against your body is an attack. And racism is a violent attack against the Black body." End quote. But wow, let me just repeat that. Racism is a violent attack against the Black body. But there is hope. There's lots of it. There are ways to minimize the health effects of racial battle fatigue. We're going to talk about that with Professor Smith shortly. This is one of the goals of the Espresso Talk Today show, to identify issues and problems unique to the Black community in America and globally, and to find practical ways of living healthy and happy and empowered lives. Professor Smith will return next week to discuss racial battle fatigue and Black rage. We kind of ended bringing in Black rage at the end of today's conversation. Black rage is a fact and a real feeling experienced by Black people living with the daily indignities of systemic racism. Professor Smith will also discuss the role of culture and community in dealing with the stress of racism. Again, I won't get ahead of the discussion. I tend to want to do that because I'm so excited about it. But let's save some for next week. At Espresso Talk Today, we are a vibrant community of amiable intellectuals who are passionate about issues affecting Black people. Community and health are very important to us, and that's why we're so happy and so grateful that Professor Smith joined us here today to discuss the concept of racial battle fatigue and living Black in an anti-Black environment. We hope that you enjoyed today's show, and we hope that you'll return to hear more of the discussion with Professor Smith as he goes into the effects of racial battle fatigue and Black rage and how to deal with them in a healthy way. And remember to send your thoughts and comments to us at team@espressotalktoday.com. Thanks again, Espresso Talk Today community, for coming through today. Soul, strength, and reparations. Asante Sana. Bye for now.